Well, welcome back. The last time we looked at the early period of the Covenanters and how the National Covenants, that's the National Covenant of 1638 and Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, were signed by these Presbyterians, they were called Covenanters for that reason. And we saw the rise of tyranny of the kings and the oppression not only against religious freedom, but against parliamentary freedom and against the rising of a democratic process in our culture. So now we're going to look at the period which is known as the Killing Time. That is the great persecution that happened against the church. So the Killing Time was a period of about 28 years, between 1661 and 1688, in which about 18,000 Scottish Presbyterians suffered for their faith. Thousands were killed. Some were killed in war, in self-defense. Others were driven out of the country, where they died of cold or famine or something like that. People were exiled. Some, even a few thousand, were sent off as slaves by their own people to the Americas. It gives you some idea of the horrendous situation that happened for people who stood up for what they believed and stood for their opinion that Christ is the head of the church, not the king, and they believed in a Christian-based democratic process. It was not until 1688 that the freedom actually did come to them. It's called the Glorious Revolution at the time of William of Orange, and we'll cover that a bit later. Let's go back to 1660. It's a time of the restoration of King Charles II. And as I said, there was drinking parties on the streets. People were glad to be rid of the Puritans because they had banned all sorts of things. They tried to control people with a whole lot of laws, some of which were quite pharisaical. And people thought, great, let's get rid of all that. Back to card games, back to drinking lots. There were scenes of fireworks on the streets in London and also our capital city in Scotland, in Edinburgh. What happened was that 9 of those who had executed the father of Charles II were executed, politicians, and also many were given life imprisonment. So within months, Charles II imprisoned some of the Covenanting leaders. There was Archibald Campbell, who was the Marquis of Argyll. He was seen as a real nuisance because he was a highly respected nobleman in Scotland and a ringleader of the Covenanters, and exercised a lot of authority and influence in this nation. So he was the first to be arrested, and alongside him was a pastor called the Reverend James Guthrie. Now, his particular crime, why Charles II hated him so much, it was reckoned that he'd written a booklet about the cause of God's wrath against Scotland. And that was because not only had the people, some of them signed the National Covenant and the Solemn League and Covenant under pressure that they had actually not followed through. So when the going were good, they agreed with the covenants, and when persecution broke out, they denied them. And so he said they were false subscriptions. But also he was challenging the nation about the sin of Scotland. The people need to repent from various sins. But he had also the amazing courage to challenge the king himself for committing perjury, to agree to the National Covenant and the Solemn League and Covenant, but in his heart to hate those documents. And so for that reason, Charles II wanted this man dead, this pastor dead, for his audacity to actually challenge the king. It's a bit like John the Baptist being beheaded. In fact, he was killed, and his head was chopped off and impaled on a spike for 27 years on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh as a warning to people, you dare to step out of line, this is what will happen to you. We get to 1661. Charles II has purged the English Parliament of all who accepted the Covenant documents, so that he now had puppet politicians in place. He also appointed the Earl of Middleton to set up a Scottish Parliament, which was mostly made up of those who did not accept the Covenants. It was called actually the Drunken Parliament because most of them were actually drunk at the time when they were dealing with this issue. And most of them swore the following: by this my solemn oath, that I acknowledge my said sovereign Charles II, only supreme governor of this kingdom, over all persons and in all causes. So by signing this, an agreement with it, the leaders of the nation of Scotland had given over Scotland to a tyrant in their drunken stupor, the most crazy thing ever. So by this, the Scottish Parliament actually gave Charles II absolute control of Scotland, and with this came the Act Recissory, by which all Acts of Parliament since 1633 were abolished, henceforth void and null. So the controlling nature of this can be seen in that no subject question or impugn anything in this act or do anything contrary thereto under the pains of treason. So now what we find is the true nature of Charles II. He had made an oath before God and the leaders of Scotland when he was crowned the King of Scotland that he would support the Covenant documents. He also said that the Acts of Parliament up to that whole point there, that they were inscribed, that they will be supported and stood for, and now he's renouncing everything, and he's committing perjury. So in this particular time we start to find the Covenanters being rounded up and executed from 1661 onwards. The next year, 1662, is also a significant year because the King's Scottish Parliament now abolishes the Great Charter of the Church of Scotland of 1592, which had been clearly, concretely, apparently, solid as anything. The Presbyterian democratic process of the Church of Scotland is now scrapped against law. And so now we see the Magna Carta of the Presbyterian Church overthrown by Charles II. So therefore, the Presbyterian Church itself has been abolished in Scotland. Remember, Charles II had made an oath before God and the people at his coronation, where he said, I, Charles, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, do assert and declare by my solemn oath, in the presence of Almighty God, the searcher of hearts, by allowance and approbation of the National Covenant and of the Solemn League and Covenant, I for myself and successors shall consent and agree to all Acts of Parliament enjoining National Covenant and Solemn League and Covenant, and fully establishing Presbyterial government. I shall never make opposition to any of these or endeavour any change thereof. So he's completely going against what he proclaimed he would do by law. So he lied and committed serious perjury, and all Puritan and Presbyterian pastors who still accepted the covenants were driven out of their churches by the Government Act of Uniformity and became homeless. That's about 2,000 pastors and their families in England are thrown out onto the streets, and about 400 pastors and their families in Scotland. The Abjuration Act of 1662 abolishes the covenants as unlawful. Copies of the covenants are burned in London and in Linlithgow in Scotland. And the Episcopalian Church, under the authority, the headship of King Charles II, is now re-established. 1663, with faithful pastors being driven from their churches, their faithful congregations followed them into the great open-air gatherings which were called conventicles, while the king had appointed puppet pastors like puppet politicians. They are puppet pastors now in charge of the churches in Scotland. Either that or they're subdued pastors who are hoping the storm will blow over and things will go back to normal. What's happened now is the church buildings are largely emptied because most of the faithful have now left them to go to the fields and to go into the secret gatherings where they could hear their pastors preach the word of God. The Scottish Parliament passed a law called the Act for Separation and Disobedience to Ecclesiastical Authority, but it was popularly called the Bishop's Dragnet, and the parishioners were told that if they did not attend the state-controlled churches, they would be fined, and priests had to report absentees to the soldiers. People could be imprisoned for not going to the state-controlled churches. 1664, Charles II sets up the Court of High Commission. This is a court held by 9 puppet bishops who were given the power to persecute the Covenanters. It's led by Archbishop James Sharp, who was a turncoat, Judas Iscariot kind of person who had been a Covenanter. And he came back, supposed to be representing the Covenanters' cause in London, and he came back supporting the king and was enthroned as an archbishop. So many Covenanters in this time were fined and imprisoned and banished and sold as slaves to the Americas. 1665, the Privy Council outlawed conventicles, these secret gatherings of the Covenanter Christians in Scotland. Anybody caught at one would be fined or imprisoned. But it starts to get worse. The noose on the neck of the Christians who are wanting to be obedient to their faith, the noose is tightening all the time. 1669, Charles II's government passed the Assertory Act, which meant that, and I quote, that His Majesty has supreme authority and supremacy over all persons and in all causes ecclesiastical, and that the ordering and disposal of the external government and policy of the Church does properly belong to His Majesty and his successors as an inherent right of the Crown. So basically it means in 1669 King Charles II can do whatever he wants with the Church and the government and the people. They're all under his complete control. That's what we're finding now. Thus, with the king being the head of the Church to do what he wanted, he could reintroduce the papacy if he chose. At the same time, the king offered the first indulgence to draw back the suffering pastors. They could exercise their parish ministries, he said, as long as they accepted him as the head of the Church and became virtual Episcopalians. 40 compromised and came back. Other indulgences in 1672 and 1679 were given as baits to try and draw back weary Presbyterian pastors who would just sit in the churches and not rock the boat. 1670, the Parliament passed a law that preachers at conventicles faced the confiscation of their properties and goods and the death penalty for treason against the king. By the time you get to 1681, it's got really bad. The Privy Council declared conventicles as rendezvouses of rebellion, and people caught, if unarmed, would be subject to the 1665 punishments. Those caught armed will be executed for treason. 1685 is a significant time. It moves into an even more controlling situation. Charles II died as a Roman Catholic, and his brother, the Duke of York, became the king. That's James VII of Scotland. He was openly a dedicated Roman Catholic. He sought to turn England and Scotland back to Rome. Anybody agreeing to the covenants would be killed on the spot. Even family devotions were outlawed. The atrocities against the Covenanters were horrific in this period. Taking the law into his own hands, as a dictator, James VII pretended to offer some toleration to the Presbyterians and nonconformists as a foil for granting places of power and influence to the Roman Catholics. Jesuits were reintroduced to bring the people back to Rome. So, we have the situation that in 1688, in Scotland, the Archbishop of Glasgow opposed him, along with the bishops of Galloway and Dunkeld, because they realise this is not just about now the Episcopalian Church, we're now going back to Rome, and they could be next in line for the chop as Anglicans. So there's a problem they've now got. So they were removed from power. So the next thing, he imprisoned 6 English bishops who spoke out against his despotic control. And this was the final straw. And particularly when his Roman Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, because they realised this would be the line in the throne to bring us back to the Roman Catholic control. Nobles and church leaders in England called for William of Orange in Holland and his wife Mary to take the throne jointly and to drive out James VII as a tyrant. So when William's army arrived down in Devon and marched, James VII's own leaders and soldiers actually abandoned him, and he fled to France for the safety of the debauched King Louis XIV. So 1689 to 1690 is a really prominent date in our history in Britain, because William and Mary were co-crowned in Westminster after signing firstly the English Bill of Rights, granting religious freedom to Protestants and freedom of Parliament and freedom of speech to debate in Parliament openly, and secondly they signed the Scottish Claim of Rights, which banned the bishops from leading the church in the Scottish nation and re-established the Presbyterian Church by law as it had been already re-established in 1592. So they had to wait almost 100 years for it to come back again after that suffering they'd been through. So you can imagine the celebration of the Presbyterian Christians in Scotland, and also the Puritans and Presbyterians in England, and also the politicians in both countries, because now we were heading towards a Christian-based democratic process in our culture, which would have an impact on shaping not just Britain, United Kingdom, but also Europe and America and far beyond. So I need to look at the reaction of the Covenanters in this period between 1638 to 1690, because there were atrocities obviously committed against the Covenanters, but also there were some cases in which the Covenanters also acted incorrectly. War is messy. So let's look at some of this. The first thing is, in the 1640s, there's a great celebration. Most of Scotland supported the Covenants except for the Highlands and Islands. If they were Roman Catholic or Episcopalian, they didn't support the Covenants. And when the 1638 National Covenant was signed by a huge crowd in St Giles in Edinburgh, Archibald Johnston, the lawyer behind it, wrote, "Edinburgh, Edinburgh, never forget this day of April, the gloriousest day that ever you enjoyed." And that was taken from his own personal diary. And when England welcomed the Covenanters from Scotland, and the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant was accepted by the English Parliament, it seemed that this was an amazing movement forward, and copies were placed all over the nation to be signed, and the Presbyterians celebrated. But it was a short-lived victory, because what happened was that we eventually end up with civil war, as I mentioned previously, and then we lead to the great sin of Scotland, when the Scots, supporting the Covenant, tried to get Charles II to sign against his conscience in support of the Covenants. They would support him get the throne back. And so that was in 1650, and he made his false oath at his coronation in 1651. So Scotland had committed a great sin, and God's judgment was on the nation. The nation had also backslidden under the trials they'd been through. The next point to bring out is the persecution and multiplication of falling away. The forbidden conventicles attracted thousands of people who risked everything for their faith. Christian revival was experienced amongst them, but it was a dark night lasting 28 years before freedom came. The godly were purified, but many fell away under the trials. John Howie in his Scots Worthies says above 18,000 people, according to calculations, suffered death or the utmost hardships and extremities. 1,700 or more were banished as slaves to America. 750 were banished to the Isles of Scotland. 3,600 were imprisoned, outlawed, or sentenced to be executed when caught. 680 killed in battles or died of their wounds from that. And 7,000 fled Scotland as refugees, and 362 were executed after trial, and 498 were slaughtered without trial. The rest died or suffered extremely through cold, hunger, abuse, or through murder. So this is a really difficult time for them. And of course, in this time of extreme suffering, people's emotions and mental state is under great pressure. They acted in self-defence. At first, the Scottish government had backed the nation in self-defence against Charles I in the Bishops' War. And when the Scottish Parliament turned against the Covenanters, they suffered persecution, but were pushed into a corner by sheer brutality. The remnant ended up acting in self-defence against the soldiers, with several battles being fought, that is particularly 1666, the Battle of Rullian Green, and 1679, the Battle of Drumclog and of Bothwell Brig. Now, there were faithful remnant, they were whittled down, who kept standing by the covenants, because they said you can't take a covenant in a time of sunshine and warm, and then when it becomes a time of icy blast and horrible conditions, we give up. We must stand faithful even to death to a covenant before God. So after decades of unrelating trials, the number of the faithful dwindled who stood fast to the covenants. Amongst them were Reverend Donald Cargill, Reverend Richard Cameron, and the Reverend James Renwick. The government called them notorious rebels and fanatics. They printed and spread their protests with the Rutherglen Declaration in 1679 and the St. Croix Declaration in 1680. Another document called the Queensferry Paper of 1680 was seized by the soldiers before it was finished. So let's look at the legacy of the Covenanters. We look at the negative view, which is very popular today. The Covenanters are often today regarded as religious fanatics, similar to the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, or the Islamic Republic of Iran. Usually the source of this condemnation comes from Sir George Mackenzie, the chief persecutor of the Covenanters, who wrote a pamphlet in 1691 called A Vindication of the Government in Scotland during the reign of King Charles II. He claimed that no man in Scotland ever suffered for his religion, and that the Covenanters believed to kill malignants was acceptable to God, the malignants being the people who had compromised and would not stand for the covenanting process. He uses several examples of Covenanter atrocities. For example, prisoners were killed and 80 women and children were drowned by Sir David Leslie's Covenanting army after being victorious over the Royalist army after the Battle of Philipshowe in 1645. Two Presbyterian ministers had encouraged Sir David Leslie to do this. This is definitely disobedience to Christ and a blot on the Covenanters. And the second example he gives is the assassination of Archbishop James Sharp by 9 Covenanters who had been pushed by severe trials and whose action appalled the majority of the Covenanters. If we look, on the other hand, at the positive view of the Covenanters, they were not angelic beings. They were ordinary people like you and me. They were the first to berate themselves for their own sins. They suffered cruelly for a long time, but the faithful remnant stood for the following things, which today are all part of our British way of life. They stood for the freedom of Presbyterian faith, which was legally accepted in 1689 and 1690 for the second time, for the first being 1592, through the Scottish Claim of Rights and the settlement of the Church of Scotland. Secondly, they had stood for freedom of Parliament, which became legal in 1689 with the English Bill of Rights. Thirdly, they stood for freedom to debate openly in Parliament, which was made legal in 1689. Fourthly, they believed in the freedom to act in self-defence against tyranny, which was legalised in 1689. Fifthly, they believed in a Christian-based democratic parliament, which came about the beginnings of it in 1689. Sixthly, they believed in a limited or constitutional monarch, which was also made law in 1689. The Reverend Donald Cargill publicly read out a decree excommunicating both Charles II and the Duke of York, later James VII, from the Church of Scotland for their crimes. At the time he was regarded as being fanatical and weird by his enemies, but this prophetic declaration became true when the nations of England and Scotland expelled the tyrant James VII 8 years later. And lastly, they believed in human rights, but the human rights they were looking at was first of all God's rights. God is the creator, it's his laws first, and Christ is the head of the church by God's decree. So that was the first thing. Love God, and secondly, love your neighbour as yourself. The human rights that came out of God's rights first. So the result of the covenants led to the English Bill of Rights and the Scottish Claim of Rights of 1689, and eventually to the American Bill of Rights of 1791, which had actually been inspired by the French movement, who had influenced the Americans. But the French themselves had been inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract, that every government ought to be held accountable by a contract. And it was this thinking which had come via the Puritan thinking, which had come via the Presbyterian thinking coming from the Covenanters. It had been a process that had gone through. And in fact, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was friends for a while with David Hume, who was a philosopher from Edinburgh. He was a historian. He knew all about the Covenanting movement. And it inspired Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was so significant in the French movement towards a democratic human rights process in France. And so when the French were calling out for liberty and equality and fraternity in their own culture, these were Christian ideals that were there right at the beginning, but they were not the Christian ideals of a bloody revolution leading to 200,000 deaths in France. And but also which came out of this movement in France and America was eventually the United Nations Charter for Human Rights of 1948. So what we're seeing is a very significant global movement that came out of something that was paid for in the blood of Covenanter Christians who've been trodden in the mud, and their name has been smeared, and they've been accused of being extremists like an Islamic State or something, when in fact they were the forerunners of our freedoms, which we take so much for granted in our culture today.